Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 17, The City on the Edge of Tomorrow. Last time we sketched out the history of the Iroquois, a confederacy of Indian tribes living in upstate New York. Iroquois culture was changed drastically by contact with Europeans. They launched a massive war of expansion even as their numbers were being reduced tenfold by disease, until they finally fell under Western domination. Today, we're going to talk about the Europeans who were closest to the Iroquois in the 1600s, the Dutch and their colony of New Netherland, which stretched in between the Chesapeake and New England. This episode will draw especially from the book New Netherland, a Dutch colony in 17th century America, by Jaap Jacobs, as well as The Island at the Center of the World by Russell Shorto, which is the more accessible of the two. Our story begins in the Dutch Republic, or what is now the Netherlands. If you don't know, the Netherlands are a low-lying country in northern Europe, sandwiched today between Germany and Belgium. Throughout the 1500s, the Netherlands were under control of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain, and so they were known as the Habsburg Netherlands. But in 1568, the Dutch revolted against their overlords, and over the course of a decades-long war, won their de facto independence. After the Dutch broke away from Spanish rule, their society progressed rapidly. They were pioneers in banking, finance, and law. Much more so than any other nation in Europe, they became a commercial people, filling the role that Venice and the Italian city-states had in the late Middle Ages. They were middle-class and mercantile. The Dutch were also pioneers in government. Upon independence, they became a republic, which was highly unusual amid all the European monarchies of the day. They had at first tried inviting aristocrats to rule them, but everyone refused out of fear of offending the Spanish. So a republic it was. The Dutch Republic was also known as the United Provinces, and as the name would suggest, it was a confederation of 7 quite independent provinces. These provinces each had their own currency, their own laws, their own courts, and their own assemblies, with varying levels of representation and suffrage. Of these provinces, Holland, which was home to the capital Amsterdam, was by far the largest, the richest, and the most powerful. Holland paid for over half of the budget of the Dutch Republic, which is why, even today, Holland is often used to refer to the Netherlands as a whole, even though that's not actually correct. The government of the Netherlands as a whole was in the hands of an assembly known as the States General, which mostly just had control over foreign policy, since each of the provinces were in charge of their own internal affairs. Each province had one vote at the States General, though they could send as many representatives as they wished. Under the control of the States General, there was an executive council as well as various other officials and administrative bodies, as one might expect. Although it was a republic, the government tended to be dominated by the elite merchant families as a de facto oligarchy, especially as time went on. And there were some offices, such as stadtholder, a very important position, which became openly hereditary over time. That's how the republic operated in a nutshell. It was complicated, decentralized, semi-representative, and relatively open by the standards of the day. Things were much more complicated than what I could describe in this extremely brief sketch, but there's no need to get into more detail, since the government of New Netherland was actually nothing like this. It was much simpler and much less representative, as we'll see. The Dutch Republic was a strongly Protestant nation, but it was also known for its tolerance. The law stated that, quote, "Each person shall remain free, especially in his religion, and that no one shall be persecuted or investigated because of their religion." There was a national church, but membership wasn't obligatory. As a result, the Netherlands became a haven for dissidents. Jews from across Europe flocked there, and when the Pilgrims fled England, it was to the Netherlands that they first went, before they decided to press on to America. So too did John Locke spend 5 years there. And many controversial books were first published in the Netherlands, even if the authors came from elsewhere, like Galileo. According to Colin Woodard, quote, "Modern scholars have estimated that Dutch printers were responsible for half of all the books published in the 17th century. This tolerance wasn't absolute, but it was certainly freer than the rest of Europe. This openness helped make the Dutch Republic into one of the cultural centers of Europe. The philosopher René Descartes lived there for 20 years, and the philosopher Baruch Spinoza came from a Jewish family that had fled Portugal during the Inquisition. Painters such as Rembrandt and Vermeer were Dutch. You can see why they called the 1600s the Dutch Golden Age. And the Dutch weren't just developing domestically during this period, they were also expanding their presence overseas, through both trade and warfare. Their primary interest was in Asia. They had begun conquering parts of Indonesia in 1605, and they'd gone as far as Japan by 1609. This was at the time when English efforts at expansion and trade were really only just beginning. Although the Dutch Republic was young, it soon became a trading powerhouse, the envy of Europe. The Americas, however, were a secondary priority in all this, and to the Dutch, North America was even less of a priority than their possessions in Brazil. So the colony of New Netherland was, at the time, a sideshow to a sideshow. Nevertheless, it is to that colony that we now must turn. The story of New Netherland itself begins with Henry Hudson, an English explorer. Hudson had led several expeditions for the Muscovy Company, one of those trading monopolies created by Queen Elizabeth. He had been looking for a northerly route to Asia with no luck. Thanks to information sent to him by his friend John Smith of Jamestown, he now believed that he could find a route through North America to the Pacific. Remember, no one knew just how wide the continent was back then. The Muscovy Company declined to fund his next expedition, and so he got support from the Dutch instead. In 1608, the Dutch East India Company hired him to find a northeast passage above Russia, but he disobeyed his orders and went to America instead. He reached the mouth of the Chesapeake but didn't go in, instead sailing north, to a land which had still hardly been charted. Now, I should probably explain the geography here. If you sail up the coast from the Chesapeake, after about 100 miles you'll reach the next big body of water, Delaware Bay, which today divides the state of Delaware from New Jersey. Hudson and his men entered the bay, but they found it to be treacherous, and so they turned back around and continued north. After another 100-something miles, they reached what is now known as New York Harbor. This was a much more promising location. If you aren't familiar with the layout of New York, it's basically a tightly packed cluster of islands right near the shore, from the western tip of Long Island to Manhattan to Staten Island. It was a great spot for a port, and it was where the Pilgrims originally intended to settle. But Hudson wasn't interested in that, he wanted the Northwest Passage. So, after some encounters with the local Indians, he sailed up the main river which flows into the harbor, now known as the Hudson. But the river was just a river. It certainly didn't lead to the Pacific. His mission was a failure, so he sailed back to Europe. He hadn't found a route to Asia, but his report of New York Harbor piqued investors' interest. It seemed like an excellent location for the Dutch to get in on the profitable fur trade, which was at the time controlled by the French. Hudson, by the way, would make only one more voyage, this time exploring Hudson Bay in Canada. His ship got stuck in the ice and they were forced to spend the winter there. In the spring, when the waters cleared, he wished to continue exploring further, but the crew mutinied and abandoned him, along with his son and some other loyal crewmen, leaving them to their fate in a small boat. They were never heard from again. But that was of no matter to the future of New Netherland, as the region was named. Within a few years, Dutch traders had sent several more expeditions to the area. They established an outpost up the Hudson River at what is now Albany, but for a while the Dutch presence there was minimal. That began to change in 1621. That year, the Dutch government created the West India Company, which was to be the American counterpart to the Dutch East India Company, which had proved so successful in Asia. The West East India Company was given a monopoly on trade with the Americas, and was hoped by the government that the company would be an effective way to attack Spanish and Portuguese interests in the New World. The main focus of the West India Company was therefore in South America and the Caribbean, but New Netherland fell within their sphere as well. One of the early goals of the company was to send colonists to New Netherland in order to more firmly support the Dutch claim on the lands. The exact borders of their new colony were ambiguous, but it began just above the Chesapeake and stretched into Connecticut, which was also claimed by the English. So basically the modern states of Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. It was hard to get people to go to the New World. Times were good in the Netherlands, and there were no persecuted religious minorities like in England, so the pool of recruits was quite small. But the West India Company managed to scrape together a few dozen people, mostly foreigners, and convince them to sail away to America. One of the ships they sent was filled with 30 families. 4 couples in the group were even married at sea. The newlyweds and everyone else began arriving in New York Harbor in early 1624, so between the arrivals of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They set themselves up on an island just south of Manhattan. Their first homes were simple pits dug into the ground and covered with bark. It was the beginning of what would become New York City, although under the Dutch it was known as New Amsterdam. A few of the settlers were also sent south to the Delaware Bay and north to Connecticut, to ensure the Dutch claims on the land. The year after that, settlement began on Manhattan itself. The common story is that the island was purchased from the local Indians for some beads worth $24, but that's apocryphal. In truth, the land was bought for goods worth perhaps a few $1,000s in today's money. Still a very good deal, all things considered. New Amsterdam, situated at the southern tip of Manhattan, soon became the capital and center of economic activity in the colony. It was about 300 miles from Jamestown and 200 miles from Boston. It was also 100-something miles south of Iroquois territory. This wasn't a full-scale colonization effort like what the English were pursuing. There were some people who supported that approach, but it was deemed too ambitious. Instead, this was more an effort to secure trading outposts. The Dutch wanted a permanent presence, but it didn't have to be too large. The economy was thus based on trade rather than on farming, like in New England or the Chesapeake. There were still plenty of farmers, of course, but that wasn't what New Amsterdam was about. People continued to arrive in the colony in dribs and drabs. By the way, the mortality rate on a voyage like that was about 4%, according to Jacobs. Imagine if every time you flew across the country you had a 4% chance of dying. Not great. Many who came to New Netherland were merchants or craftsmen. Others were soldiers in the service of the company. Most of these men left America after a time, but some remained, forming the nucleus of a new community. There were servants, too, who were generally better treated than their counterparts in Virginia. Their terms of service were briefer, their contracts couldn't be bought and sold, and it was easier for them to escape from abusive masters. In addition to New Amsterdam, the Dutch also continued their presence up the Hudson River at Albany. This brought them to the southern edges of Iroquois land, specifically land controlled by the Mohawk. The land to the south was controlled by various Algonquian tribes, as I discussed last episode. The Dutch had at first befriended the Mohican tribe, an Algonquian-speaking group that lived closer to the coast. The Mohicans had welcomed the Dutch as potential allies against the Mohawk, who were aggressively expanding their territory. But when the Dutch tried to support their new friends against the Mohawks, they were swiftly defeated. One Dutchman was even cannibalized. The Dutch soon decided that it was better to befriend powerful tribes rather than weaker ones, and so they became major trading partners and sometime allies of the Iroquois instead. Like the Puritans, the Dutch also adopted the use of wampum as money, along with beaver pelts, although fur was a less than ideal currency since the quality of pelts was quite variable. Trade with the Native Americans was always a fraught issue. In order to keep the Indians weaker, selling them weapons was prohibited and could result in the death penalty, at least in theory. But that wasn't enough to stop the trade. Certainly the Iroquois got their hands on enough guns to rapidly expand their territory, as we heard last time. Later on, those restrictions on selling guns would be loosened in acknowledgement of their ineffectiveness. Alcohol, too, caused problems. Alcohol and the social ills associated with it were European exports just as much as guns and diseases were. Drunkenness and alcoholism soon became chronic problems among the Indians. Because of the disruption it caused, not just to the Indians themselves but to relations between the Indians and the Dutch, selling alcohol to Indians could result in, quote, a fine of 500 guilders, flogging, and banishment. In practice, however, punishments were much lighter, according to Jacobs. Dutch efforts to convert the Indians to Christianity were less successful than those of the Jesuits in French territory. The Dutch were less willing to meet the Indians halfway, as it were, to learn their languages, that sort of thing. There were some wars between the two groups, but they weren't as bad as what happened in the English colonies. Overall, the Dutch presence was just too small and too focused purely on trade to cause the same sort of problems. The government of the colony was in the hands of the West India Company. The company was not totally independent from the Dutch government. The state had a representative on the board of directors, and it was also partly subsidizing the company, but it was a private for-profit enterprise. So the ultimate loyalty of New Netherland was to the Dutch Republic, but in practice administration was in the hands of the company. Well, in actuality, a small committee within the company made most of the decisions. Within the colony itself, administration and justice were in the hands of the Director General and an Executive Council, all of whom were appointed back in Europe. The Director General was the equivalent of a governor, although of a slightly lower rank, since New Netherland wasn't deemed important enough to have a full governor. The director was the chief executive, but he was obligated to seek the approval of the council. He wasn't free to act on his own. and all of their decisions and laws were ultimately subject to approval from the company. There were no elected positions within the colony at all. The West India Company was directly in charge. They appointed the Director General and his advisors with no equivalent to an elected lower house. In its early years, the colony was beset by bureaucratic infighting and weak yet authoritarian leadership. The officials who were willing to go to America were generally second-rate, and in 1632, the company, according to Jacobs, had to, quote, replace the entire administration. According to Charles M. Andrews, one director alone was, quote, charged with pride and vainglory, with indolence and carelessness, with drunkenness, quote, as long as there is any wine, and with hostility towards religion, end quote. The next director started a fruitless years-long war against local Indian tribes, only to be recalled in disgrace and then die in a shipwreck on the way back to Europe. Needless to say, this sort of general mismanagement didn't help in attracting more settlers. In the beginning, New Amsterdam was a rough town, violent and boisterous. Bars, prostitution, pirates, etc. Like Jamestown had been, the colony wasn't yet a fully realized society. It was just an outpost. In those first few years, New Netherland didn't prove very profitable. This led to a split in the company. Some wanted to minimize further investment. That way the company could still reap the profits of the fur trade without much further cost. Others wanted to expand the colony into profitability by attracting enough farmers to make the colony self-sustaining. Then perhaps even bigger profits could be made thanks to their monopoly on trade. The two sides compromised by coming up with the patroonship system. The patroonship system was an attempt to attract wealthy settlers by offering them large estates. In exchange for bringing 50 or more colonists to New Netherland, these wealthy settlers, or patroons as they were known, would each be given a great deal of power on their lands, similar to what the Lords Baltimore enjoyed in Maryland. They would have near absolute authority, with all powers of government, even the right to execute subjects. The goal here was to make others bear the costs of colonization, since the company was unwilling to pay for it itself. A number of members of the West India Company set up patroonships of their own, but unfortunately for them, few people wanted to live under such conditions. Some patroonships never got off the ground. Another was entirely wiped out by Indians. Only one lasted longer than a few years. Just as in the English colonies, any attempts to establish feudalism in the New World were pretty much dead on arrival. Overlords like the Baltimores could keep things going for a while, but only in the face of ongoing resistance from the colonists. You might think that it would make sense to go in the opposite direction and make the colony more politically open. That worked well enough in Jamestown, after all. Well, perhaps they could have, but the situation in New Netherland was different. The Virginia Company had had constant money problems, and Jamestown was the only settlement they controlled. The West India Company, on the other hand, had more important possessions in the Caribbean and Brazil. New Netherland was a secondary concern, and they didn't feel the need to attract a lot of migrants as the Virginia Company had. And they weren't sure about the financial wisdom of expansion anyway. Perhaps partly as a result, there wasn't the same pressure to add some sort of representative element to their rule. Nevertheless, over time, small towns popped up across New Netherland, but all of them remained small. A number of these towns, particularly on Long Island, were settled by the English rather than by the Dutch. As I mentioned, the border between New Netherland and Connecticut was unsettled. As a result, a number of English towns were founded in the territory that was thought to be English but wound up being controlled by the Dutch instead. Other times it was because settlers were fleeing the persecution of New England. You'll recall that Anne Hutchinson left Massachusetts for Rhode Island and then went on to New Netherland, only to be killed by Indians along with much of her family. These English towns were given a good deal of independence, and to some extent they just replicated the New England way of doing things, although there was nothing like the full-on town meetings in New England proper that we've heard about. Local towns often had at least some say in the officials who were put in charge of them, but their choices were still subject to company approval. These local officials were tasked with routine administration and the hearing of minor court cases. But overall, as you can see, there was very little popular participation in government. Things were done in a top-down way, even if the colonists were given at least some input from time to time. Residents of the colony were also sometimes called on to give advice to the directors, through the creation of informal groups of counselors. But in practice things often got more complicated than you might expect. For example, in 1641, a farmer in New Amsterdam was killed by an Indian. In response to this attack, the Director General, Willem Kieft, the guy who would drown in a shipwreck, called together the heads of local households to give him advice. Those men then chose from among themselves 12 men to counsel the director. That was at least kind of an election, I guess. This body, known conveniently as the 12 Men, went well beyond its instructions, offering the director more than just recommendations on policy towards the Indians. They also requested changes to the colony's administration and courts. The director was reasonably receptive to some of their proposals, but he nevertheless soon dismissed them and forbade them from meeting again, lest they start to get ideas. However, relations with the local Indians broke down further, with the massacre of some 80 natives, followed by further reprisals against the settlers. Kieft felt it wise to summon the burghers, who were sort of the equivalent of freemen, for further consultation. From those 46 burghers, 8 were elected to serve on a new body, known conveniently as the 8 Men. The 8 Men had a bit more power than the 12 Men had had. They weren't just there to provide advice on a specific issue. They also had the right to recruit soldiers as needed. But they weren't supposed to have any real authority. Nevertheless, just like the 12 Men, they also went beyond their instructions, going over the director's head by sending requests for assistance back to the Netherlands. In the next year, 1644, they even tried to get the director removed, and convinced the West India Company to grant them a representative government. They asked for the right to, quote, elect from among themselves a bailiff, or schout and schepens. Those are just the names for government positions, who will be empowered to send their deputies and give their votes on public affairs with the director and council, so that the entire country may not be hereafter, at the whim of one man, again reduced to similar danger. This was quite a big request, to completely change how the colony was run, and for the most part the company ignored it. They did decide to recall Kieft for incompetence, but that was about it. Kieft's replacement, Peter Stuyvesant, would serve as Director General for the next 17 years. Stuyvesant, the son of a minister, was only 35 when he arrived in the colony. A college dropout, Stuyvesant joined the West India Company as a young man and quickly rose through the ranks. He was named governor of the island of Curacao in the Caribbean, and while serving there, he led an attack on another island, only to get hit by a cannonball and lose his leg in the fighting. He returned to the Dutch Republic to recuperate, and while there, the West India Company named him the Director of New Netherland. Beyond his bravery, he also had a reputation as a strong leader and a solid administrator, so he was a natural choice for the position, despite his new peg leg. When he arrived in New Amsterdam, Stuyvesant faced the problem of what to do with the 8 men. After all, in their appeal to Amsterdam, they had been quite disobedient to the previous director, even treasonous. And the new director was certainly no fan of representative government. After a trial in which the colonists refused to back down, Stuyvesant sentenced a few of the ringleaders to banishment. The 8 men were thus disbanded, but in their place, Stuyvesant created a new grouping of 9 men, conveniently known as the 9 Men. Realistically, he had to give the colonists at least some input if he wanted to raise funds and keep things running smoothly. The way this worked was that the local burghers named 18 men, and Stuyvesant and the council picked 9 of those men to actually serve. This practice is sometimes known as double nomination. It was a way to balance popular control with central control. Both the people and the government had veto power over nominees. Anyway, 3 of the 9 men were to be merchants, 3 were burghers, and 3 were farmers. 6 of the 9 men would be replaced each year. Like the 12 men and the 8 men, the 9 men had limited authority, which they nevertheless exceeded. When Stuyvesant got word that the 9 men were sending a new petition back to Amsterdam behind his back to undermine him, he had their leader, Adrian van der Donck, imprisoned for libel, although he was later freed. Afterwards, van der Donck returned to the Netherlands to argue his position on behalf of the colonists. They had several demands, including the creation of a city government for New Amsterdam, which actually had less independence than the outlying towns did. Most importantly, they wished to be freed, not just from Stuyvesant but from the West India Company altogether. They wanted to be ruled directly by the Dutch government. He arrived in the Netherlands in 1649, soon after the beheading of Charles I, as well as after the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended both the 30 Years' War in Germany and the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. Finally, Dutch independence was fully recognized. The Treaties of Westphalia were also an important precedent in the idea of states as sovereign entities on an equal diplomatic footing, as opposed to the earlier system based around webs of feudal loyalties. Big changes were happening in Europe. Anyway, the colonists presented their lengthy petition to the States General, arguing that the Republic would be strengthened by the full annexation of New Netherland, which could in time hugely boost the income of the small republic. The ideas were favorably received, although the government didn't go so far as to agree to annexation. They did, however, agree to some substantial changes, such as adding a number of elected men to the council. But thanks to delays within the Netherlands and the start of the First Anglo-Dutch War, which I'll get to next episode, those proposals never went anywhere. The only real change was the creation of a city government for New Amsterdam, but there weren't any elections even for that. Instead, officials chose their successors through a process of double nomination, much like with the 9 men. Overall, the company was still in charge. So that's a brief summary of what the government of New Netherland was like. It may have been a bit confusing since there were a lot of half-implemented ideas and whatnot, but let me give a brief summary to make sure everything's clear. New Netherland was ultimately in the hands of the West India Company, and it was the company which appointed the top officials in the colony, the director and the councillors, who had final authority within the colony itself. There were no elected assemblies, but there were occasional advisory bodies chosen from among the colonists, with few official powers. Towns weren't self-governing, but they did have some say over the officials who were placed in charge of them. And throughout the second half of the colony's existence, there was constant pressure for greater self-government. The rule of the West India Company was always going to be an awkward fit once colonization took off. The company was focused on profit, but the colonists themselves wanted good government, and those two interests didn't necessarily go hand in hand. Things were rarely terrible, but the company was seen as an impediment rather than an ally. The company perennially underinvested in the colony. Teachers were scarce and public buildings were shoddy. Even the fort was in a state of disrepair. Quite a contrast to New England, where the citizens were in direct control of public spending. Just like how in the English colonies many would have preferred direct rule to the control of some proprietor, many in New Netherland would rather have been ruled by the Dutch government itself, or maybe even by themselves. We can see in New Netherland the same sort of mildly rebellious attitude that existed in the English colonies. Nobody was thinking about full independence, but the citizens did want to have a major say in how things were run, and the ability to veto policies they didn't like. It seems clear to me that, sooner or later, changes would have been made as the colony grew and as demands for reforms increased. But because of the English takeover, all of that came to a premature end. Well, the pressure for self-rule would continue, but it was under an English flag and not a Dutch one. Next episode will both continue and end the story of New Netherland by diving into its conquest by the English. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.